Question 1. What is AEM Forms and what business problems does it solve? AEM Forms is the forms and document processing capability of Adobe Experience Manager. It enables organizations to create, publish, manage, and process digital forms and documents at enterprise scale. The business problems it solves are fundamental to modern enterprises. Paper-based and legacy electronic forms are costly, error-prone, and deliver terrible user experiences. They cannot adapt to the device the user is on, do not validate data in real time, require manual processing of submissions, and cannot be easily integrated with back-end systems. AEM Forms addresses all of these. Adaptive forms are smart, responsive, multi-step forms that work equally well on desktop browsers, tablets, and mobile phones. They provide real-time field validation, conditional logic, showing and hiding fields based on previous answers, data pre-filling from CRM or database sources, and save and resume capabilities so users can start on one device and finish on another. Government agencies use AEM Forms for citizen services like permit applications and benefits enrollment. Banks use it for account opening and loan applications. Insurance companies use it for claim submission. Healthcare providers use it for patient intake. The document services capability adds the ability to generate, transform, and sign PDF documents programmatically, creating statements, contracts, and certificates from templates. The integrated workflow engine allows submissions to trigger approval workflows routing documents to the right people. Forms Portal provides a website section where users can see all their submitted forms and track status. Together, these capabilities transform paper-intensive processes into streamlined digital experiences with compliance, auditability, and integration. Question 2. What are adaptive forms and how do they differ from HTML5 forms and classic foundation forms? Adaptive forms are the modern, recommended form technology in AEM Forms 6.2 and later. They are schema-driven, responsive, rules-capable forms built on a sophisticated component model. Adaptive forms consist of panels, fields, and layout components arranged in a hierarchical structure. They adapt their layout to different screen sizes automatically. They support complex business rules through a visual rule editor that allows non-technical authors to define show, hide conditions, validations, calculations, and data pre-fill without writing JavaScript. Adaptive forms can be bound to schemas, XML schema, JSON schema, or form data model, which links each field to a structured data model for submission and pre-fill. Classic foundation forms are legacy AEM components, simple drag-and-drop form fields available in AEM sites that submit to a configurable endpoint. They are suitable for simple contact forms but lack the advanced features of adaptive forms, no multi-step wizards, no conditional rules, no save and resume, no FDM binding. They are deprecated in favor of adaptive forms. HTML5 forms are mobile-friendly renditions of XFA-based forms, forms originally designed in Lifecycle Designer and converted for HTML delivery. They maintain exact visual fidelity with the XFA layout, which is important for organizations that have existing XFA form investments. However, they use a different rendering engine and have limitations compared to adaptive forms. For any new development, adaptive forms are the standard. Core components-based adaptive forms, introduced in AEM Forms June 5, 16 and AEM Forms as a cloud service, are the latest generation, using AEM's core components architecture for better accessibility, performance, and extensibility. They replace the older foundation component-based adaptive forms as the recommended implementation approach. Question 3. Explain the form data model in AEM Forms. How does it enable data integration? The form data model, commonly abbreviated as FDM, is AEM Forms data integration layer that provides an abstraction between adaptive forms and backend data sources. It solves a critical integration challenge. Adaptive forms need to pre-fill with data from CRM systems, submit data to databases, and invoke business services, but hard-coding these integrations in every form is unsustainable. The FDM acts as a service facade. You configure the FDM once with connections to your data sources, REST APIs, SOAP web services, OData services, JDBC databases, and Salesforce through connectors. For each data source, the FDM automatically discovers the available entities. For a REST API, it imports the Swagger or OpenAPI specification. For a database, it imports table schemas. For SOAP, it imports the WSDL. You then compose a data model from these entities, selecting the fields you need and defining read and write services. The read service fetches data for pre-filling and the write service submits data. The FDM also supports associations between entities. If your form spans customer and order data from different sources, the FDM models the relationship. When binding an adaptive form to an FDM, you connect each form field to an FDM entity property using bind references. On form load, the read service is invoked, with the current user's context, like their customer ID, and the response data pre-fills the bound fields. On submission, the write service is invoked with the form data mapped to the FDM's write operation parameters. Custom pre-fill services can be written in Java implementing the data provider interface and registered as OSGI services, providing data from sources not covered by the built-in connectors. The FDM also enables form-based data lookup. A drop-down field can fetch its options dynamically from an FDM read service, showing real-time data from a backend system. Question 4. How does Adaptive Form Rule Editor work? What types of rules can you create? The Adaptive Form Rule Editor is a visual, no-code interface embedded in the AEM Forms authoring experience that allows business analysts and form authors to define the dynamic behavior of adaptive forms without writing JavaScript. Rules are conditions and actions that execute in real time as the user fills the form. The rule editor generates JavaScript rules under the hood, but presents them in a visual or guided expression format that non-developers can understand. There are several categories of rules. Show and hide rules control field visibility based on conditions. For example, show the field spouse name when the field marital status equals married. Enable and disable rules control whether a field is interactive. Set value rules compute and set a field's value. For example, set the field total price to quantity multiplied by unit price. Validate rules run custom validation beyond basic required and pattern checks. For example, validate that end date is after start date. Set options dynamically populates a drop-down's options based on another field's value. For example, when country changes, reload state options from a service call. Set property rules change a field's label, placeholder, or help text dynamically. Invoke service rules call a form data model service and map the response to form fields, used for real-time lookups like address autocomplete from a postal code. Navigate to panel rules control which wizard step the user is on. Rules can reference other rules through functions, allowing rule reuse. Advanced users can switch from the visual rule editor to the code editor view and write custom JavaScript directly. Custom functions, registered as JavaScript files in a client lib with the af.customWidgets category, are available in the rule editor and allow reusable business logic across multiple rules and multiple forms. Question 5. What is document of record in AEM Forms and when is it needed? Document of record, abbreviated as DOR, is an archival PDF document generated automatically when an adaptive form is submitted. It captures the state of the completed form, the fields that were shown and filled, in a styled, printable format that serves as the definitive record of the interaction. This is critical for compliance, legal, and archival purposes. Consider a loan application form. When the user submits it, the data goes to the back-end system. But the bank also needs a legally defensible PDF document showing exactly what the applicant filled in, on what date, with what values, and any required signature or acknowledgement. The document of record fulfills this requirement. There are two approaches to generating the DOR. The first approach is template-based DOR. You design a DOR PDF template in Adobe Lifecycle Designer or Adobe Acrobat with form fields that map to the adaptive forms fields using the bind reference path. When the form is submitted, AEM Forms uses the Document Services Output service to merge the submitted data with the template and generate the final PDF. This gives full control over the DOR appearance, professional, branded PDF layouts. The second approach is auto-generated DOR. AEM Forms automatically generates a DOR based on the adaptive forms structure and layout without a separate PDF template. This is simpler but less polished visually. The DOR is generated server-side through the Document Services API and can be stored in the JCR, sent by email, submitted to the Forms portal, or pushed to an external document management system through a workflow step. For regulated industries, healthcare, financial services, government, DOR generation and archival is often a compliance requirement, and AEM Forms provides this capability out of the box. Question 6. Explain AEM Forms document services. What are output, forms, and doc assurance services? AEM Forms Document Services is a set of server-side OSGI services for programmatic generation, manipulation, transformation, and securing of PDF documents. These services are the core of AEM Forms document processing capabilities and are used both by adaptive forms workflows and by custom Java code. The output service merges XML data with a PDF or XDP form template to generate a non-interactive PDF document. Think filling in a form template with data from a database to produce thousands of personalized statements, letters, or certificates in batch. It supports batch generation, streaming output, print stream generation for PCL or PS printers, and compression. The Forms service renders interactive forms, XFA-based forms, as HTML5 or PDF for end-user interaction, manages form data extraction from submitted PDFs, and handles form rendering with data pre-population. The Doc Assurance service, also called the Reader Extension service and the Signature service, applies usage rights to PDF documents, enabling features in Adobe Reader that are otherwise only available in full Acrobat, saving filled forms, adding comments, signing digitally. It also handles digitally signing PDF documents with X.509 certificates, verifying signatures, encrypting and decrypting PDFs with passwords or certificate-based encryption, certifying documents to detect post-certification changes, and applying watermarks. The Assembler service combines multiple PDF documents, rearranges pages, extracts page ranges, applies bookmarks, and generates PDF portfolios. It uses a DDX, Document Description XML, language to describe the assembly operations. These services are accessed through Java APIs in OSGI services or workflow steps, enabling complex document automation scenarios like generating personalized annual account statements for millions of banking customers. Question 7. How do you implement a multi-step wizard form in AEM Forms? Multi-step wizard forms in AEM Forms break a long form into logical sections presented as sequential steps, significantly improving completion rates by reducing cognitive load. Users see only one section at a time. Implementing a wizard in adaptive forms uses the wizard layout component. At the top level of your adaptive form, you set the layout to wizard. Under the wizard, you create multiple panels. Each panel is one step of the wizard. Each panel has a title that appears in the step indicator at the top or side of the form. You configure navigation buttons, Previous, Next, and Submit, on the panels. Navigation rules control progression. The next button moves to the next panel, but only if the current panel's validations pass. You configure the panel's validation behavior. All field validation validates all fields in the panel before allowing navigation. Submit only validates on final submission. Each wizard step can have its own layout. Some steps might use a 2-column layout for compact data entry, others a single-column layout for complex sections. You can show a step summary, a read-only summary panel at the end showing all entered data for review before submission. The step progress indicator can be configured as a numbered list, a progress bar, or breadcrumbs. For very long forms, lazy loading of panels improves initial load time. Panels not yet visited are not rendered in the DOM until the user navigates to them. Custom JavaScript in the panel's enter event can trigger server calls, for example, calling an FDM service when the user enters a panel to pre-fill data relevant to that step based on choices made in previous steps. Each panel corresponds to a schema fragment, so data is organized into nested objects matching the step structure. The multi-step approach also supports conditional steps. An entire panel can be shown or hidden based on an earlier answer, creating branched form flows. Question 8. What is Forms-centric AEM workflow and how does it integrate with adaptive forms? Forms-centric AEM workflow is a specialized extension of AEM's standard workflow engine specifically designed for form and document processing. It provides workflow steps that understand forms, documents, and the forms workflow data model, making it the natural choice for automating form submission handling. When an adaptive form is submitted, the submission action, configured in the form's basic settings, can trigger an AEM workflow. The submission action start workflow passes the submitted form data, the document of record, and any attached files to the workflow as payload. The workflow receives this data in the metadata map and the form data is stored as a data XML payload in the CRX repository under the payload node. Form-centric workflow steps include assign task, which creates a task in the AEM inbox for a specified user or group. The task includes the form with the submitted data for review, and the reviewer can approve, reject, or escalate. Generate document of record generates a PDF record and attaches it to the payload. Send email sends a notification with the form data and attachments. Generate PDF generates a PDF from the form data using a template. Sign document integrates with Adobe Sign for electronic signatures. The workflow pauses, sends the document to the specified signers, and resumes when all signatures are collected. Invoke form data model service calls an FDM write service to push data to a backend system. Store adaptive form data stores the form submission to a configurable location. Convert to PDF converts the form submission to PDF. Custom workflow steps are implemented as Java classes implementing workflow process and have access to the form data through the metadata map. The Forms Workflow OSGI service provides helper methods for reading and writing form data within workflow steps, and for navigating the form's data XML structure. Question 9. How does pre-filling work in AEM adaptive forms? Pre-filling in AEM adaptive forms populates form fields automatically with data from a backend system when the form loads, improving the user experience by eliminating redundant data entry. There are multiple pre-fill approaches. The simplest is URL parameter prefill. You append the AF-bound data query parameter to the form URL with a base 64 encoded XML or JSON data payload. The form reads this parameter on load and populates bound fields from the data. This is useful for prefilling from links in emails or CRM systems. The FDM-based prefill uses a form data model configured with a read service. The form is configured to invoke the FDM read service on load. The service is called with context data, typically the current user's ID or a case reference from a URL parameter, and returns structured data that maps to the form's fields through the bind references. For example, a customer data FDM read service called with the logged-in user's customer ID returns the customer's address, phone, and profile information, which prefills the corresponding form fields. The custom prefill service approach lets you write a Java class implementing the data provider or prefill service interface as an OSGI service. You register it with a service name, configure the form to use that service name, and implement the data retrieval logic, querying a database, calling an API, reading from the JCR. The service returns a data XML document with the form data structure. CRX prefill reads data from a previously submitted form stored in the CRX repository, enabling reopen and edit scenarios. Sign URL prefill is used when a form link is sent via email and the URL contains a signed token embedding the prefilled data for security. For each approach, the field bind references must match the structure of the prefilled data exactly. A mismatch means fields do not get prefilled. Question 10. Explain the AEM form submission pipeline, from submit button to data storage. The adaptive form submission pipeline is a sequence of processing steps that execute when the user clicks submit, handling validation, pre-processing, action execution, and error handling. Understanding this pipeline is essential for custom submission implementations. Step 1 is client-side validation. The browser runs all JavaScript validation rules defined in the rule editor. If any field fails validation, submission is blocked and error messages are displayed. Step 2 is the submit action execution. AEM Forms sends an AJAX request to the form submission endpoint, typically the af.submit.js sling servlet at /AEM/forms/submission. The request body contains the form data as XML or JSON encoded as multipart form data along with any uploaded file attachments. Step 3 is the server-side submit handler. The Sling servlet receives the request and invokes the configured submit action. AEM Forms provides built-in submit actions, send email composes and sends an email with the form data. Submit to REST endpoint posts the data as JSON or XML to a configured REST URL. Invoke FDM submit service calls the FDM's write service. Invoke AEM workflow starts the specified AEM workflow with the form data as payload. Store content in JCR saves the submission to a node under /content/user generated. Submit to SharePoint or Salesforce are pre-built connectors. A custom submit action is a folder under /apps with a addfields.jsp that defines submit action parameters and a post.jsp or Sling servlet that handles the actual submission. In this handler you have full access to the Sling request, the form data XML, and the AEM repository. Step 4 is the confirmation. On success, the form shows a configured success message, redirects to a thank you page, or keeps the form filled for data entry continuation. Step 5 is error handling. Submission errors are surfaced to the user with actionable messages. The entire submission can be audited through the Forms portal's drafts and submissions feature. Question 11. What is Adobe Sign integration with AEM Forms? Adobe Sign, formerly EchoSign, integration with AEM Forms provides legally binding electronic signature capabilities within form and document workflows. Electronic signatures eliminate the need to print, sign, scan, and mail documents, transforming signature-intensive processes like contracts, agreements, and consent forms into fully digital workflows with legal validity in most jurisdictions under electronic signature laws like ASIGN in the US and EIDAS in Europe. The integration works at 2 levels. The first level is the adaptive form with Adobe Sign-enabled fields. In an adaptive form, you can mark specific fields as signature fields using the Adobe Sign signature component. When the form is submitted with Adobe Sign enabled, AEM Forms sends the form as a document to Adobe Sign along with the signer configuration, who needs to sign, in what order, what type of signature is required, initials, electronic signature, digital signature. Adobe Sign emails the signer with a secure link. The signer opens the document in the Adobe Sign web interface, fills required fields if any, signs electronically using a drawn, typed, or uploaded signature, and submits. Adobe Sign notifies AEM when all signatures are collected. AEM Forms then receives the signed PDF. The second level is workflow-based signing. The sign document workflow step in a Forms-centric workflow initiates a signing request. This is used when the document to be signed is generated by the workflow, for example, a contract generated by the output service, rather than being the submitted form itself. AEM Forms provides a pre-built cloud configuration for Adobe Sign that stores the API key and account settings. Multiple Adobe Sign accounts can be configured for different business units. The entire signature process is auditable. Adobe Sign generates a certificate of completion PDF showing who signed, when, from what IP address, and the document fingerprint. Question 12. How do you implement custom form field components in AEM Forms? Custom form field components extend adaptive forms with field types not available out of the box, things like star rating pickers, color pickers, signature pads, OTP input with masked display, or complex custom pickers. Creating a custom field component requires understanding both the AEM component framework and the adaptive forms rendering lifecycle. For foundation component-based adaptive forms, a custom field component is an AEM component with a specific set of files. The component node is under /apps/urap/components/adaptive form fields. The rendering script, widget.ftl for FreeMarker or widget.html for HTL, renders the HTML for the field, including the datasli resource includes for the component's subproperties. A JavaScript file implements the AF widget interface, specifically the setValue, getValue, focus, and optionally a custom init method. This widget is registered with the adaptive form widget registry using widgetregistry.registerWidget. The widget type property on the component node links the component to its JavaScript widget class. For core components-based adaptive forms, the modern approach, you extend the React-based form component library. Custom field components are React components that implement the with rule engine props higher order component pattern from the AEM Forms/AF React components package. They receive value and dispatch props through the AF React bridge layer, which handles two-way binding between the React component and the AF data model. These components are registered through the form field wrapper pattern and packaged as client libs. The AEM Forms schema validator validates that your component's data output matches the expected schema type, text, number, boolean, for correct FDM binding. For both approaches, the key challenge is implementing the two-way data binding correctly. The field component must update the form data model when its value changes and display the current model value when it changes externally. Question 13. What is AEM Forms HTML5 forms and when would you use XFA-based forms? HTML5 forms in AEM Forms is the mechanism for rendering XFA-based form templates, originally designed in Adobe Lifecycle Designer, as responsive HTML5 pages suitable for mobile and modern web browsers. XFA stands for XML Forms Architecture, a specification for interactive forms with rich layout capabilities. XFA forms were the standard in Adobe Lifecycle Forms, the predecessor to AEM Forms, and many enterprises have large investments in existing XFA form portfolios. AEM's HTML5 forms rendering engine takes an XDP file, the XFA template format, stored in the AEM repository and renders it as HTML5 for end-user interaction in a browser, replacing the legacy PDF-based interactive form experience that required Adobe Acrobat or Reader with full PDF support. The rendered HTML5 form maintains the visual layout of the XFA template, supports the form scripting model, XFA's form calc and JavaScript scripting languages for field rules, and handles data submission. HTML5 forms support a key set of XFA features but not all: complex subform layout, field-level scripts, signature fields, barcode fields, and calculated fields are supported. Features relying on PDF-specific capabilities are not. You would choose HTML5 forms over adaptive forms specifically when you have existing XFA investments and want to modernize delivery without redesigning the form, when the form's complex layout must be preserved exactly, especially for regulatory forms with specific positioning requirements, or when integrating with existing lifecycle-based backend processes that expect XFA data submission format. For new form development, adaptive forms are always preferred because they are mobile-first, more flexible, have the modern rule editor, FDM integration, and DOR capabilities. HTML5 forms is essentially a migration bridge technology. Question 14. What is the AEM Forms Workflow Inbox? The AEM Forms Workflow Inbox, also called the AEM Inbox, is the task management UI in AEM where human workflow participants receive and act on tasks assigned to them through form-centric workflows. When a workflow step assigns a task to a user or group, through the Assign Task workflow step, a task item appears in the assignee's AEM inbox at /AEM/inbox. The inbox interface shows all pending tasks across all workflows the user is involved in, not just forms tasks but also sites page review tasks, DAM approval tasks, and any other AEM workflow tasks. Each task shows the task title, description, deadline, priority, and the workflow it belongs to. For forms tasks, opening a task typically opens the adaptive form with the submitted data pre-populated in review mode. The reviewer can approve, reject, or reassign the task, and optionally add comments. Multiple route options, defined in the workflow model's Assign Task Step configuration, appear as action buttons. Selecting an action routes the workflow to the next configured step. The inbox supports task delegation and group task claiming. Group tasks can be claimed by any member of the group to take ownership. Inbox filtering allows finding tasks by status, date range, priority, or workflow model. The inbox also exposes task information through the /bin/query builder endpoint, enabling custom dashboard applications or mobile apps to display tasks. For large organizations with many workflow participants, AEM's Groups feature allows team-based task assignment. All members of a group see group tasks and any member can claim and process them. Email notifications can be configured to alert assignees when new tasks arrive. Custom inbox views, implementing inbox query provider, filter and sort tasks specific to a business context. Question 15. How does AEM Forms handle accessibility? What WCAG guidelines are supported? Accessibility in AEM Forms is critical for government and public sector deployments where compliance with WCAG 2.1 Level AA or Section 508 is legally required, and for any organization committed to inclusive design. AEM Forms adaptive forms are designed with accessibility as a core requirement. The foundation component-based forms and the newer core components-based forms both implement ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, attributes throughout their HTML output. Form fields render with proper label associations through for and ID attributes or the ARIA labeled by pattern. Required fields include ARIA required. Error messages are connected to fields through ARIA described B. Focus management ensures that as the user navigates the form with keyboard, focus moves predictably between fields, through wizard steps, and to error summaries. Color contrast ratios in the default themes meet WCAG 2.1 AA contrast requirements of 4.5 to 1 for text and 3 to 1 for large text. The Forms tab order follows a logical reading order. Field set and legend elements group related fields semantically. The live region pattern, ARIA-live, is used for dynamically appearing error messages so screen readers announce them without a page reload. For core components-based adaptive forms, the underlying components use Coral UI's accessible component implementations. The Adobe Forms accessibility statement documents tested assistive technologies, JAWS, NVIDIA, VoiceOver, and browser combinations. Developers must be careful when implementing custom rule editor logic that shows and hides fields to ensure hidden fields are actually hidden from the accessibility tree using CSS display, none or hidden attributes, not just visually hidden with opacity or position. Custom field components must implement the accessibility patterns correctly, labels, descriptions, error associations, and keyboard interaction. AEM Forms also supports PDF accessibility for document of record and output service-generated PDFs through the Accessibility Checker and the Forms Services Accessibility Transformation. Question 16. What is Forms Portal in AEM Forms? Forms Portal is an AEM component set that creates a self-service section on an AEM site's website where users can discover, fill, save, submit, and review forms. Rather than users navigating to isolated form URLs, Forms Portal provides a centralized hub for all form interactions. The key Forms Portal components are the Search and Lister component, Drafts and Submissions component, and Link component. The Search and Lister component displays a searchable catalog of published adaptive forms and HTML5 forms. It renders form cards, showing the form title, description, and thumbnail, and supports filtering by form category, date published, and full-text search of form titles and descriptions. Configuration controls which forms are listed, specific forms, forms from a specific folder, or all forms matching a query. The Link component renders a styled link to a specific form for featured forms on landing pages. The Drafts and Submissions component shows the current user's in-progress form saves, drafts, and their completed submissions. Users can click a draft to resume filling it from where they left off. They can view submitted forms in a read-only detail view showing the data they submitted and the document of record. For authentication, Forms Portal requires users to be logged in through an AEM authentication mechanism. Forms Portal components are not rendered for anonymous users by default, though this can be configured for specific use cases like public search without login. The draft storage uses the User Data Repository service, configurable to store drafts in the JCR, in a database, or in a custom storage. For GDPR compliance, a custom User Data Repository implementation can store draft and submission data in a database with proper data residency and deletion capabilities, separate from the AEM JCR. Question 17. Explain the AEM Forms data storage options for form submissions. AEM Forms offers multiple options for storing submitted form data, and the right choice depends on scale, integration requirements, compliance needs, and access patterns. JCR storage is the default. Submitted data is stored as XML nodes under /content/forms/fp in the JCR repository. This is simple and requires no external infrastructure, but it is not suitable for high-volume submissions because JCR is not optimized for high-throughput write operations and querying submission data requires AEM's Query Builder, less efficient than SQL for complex reporting. It also raises GDPR concerns since personal data is stored in AEM's repository, which may not be a compliant data residency location. Database storage uses a custom Forms data service that stores submissions in a relational database, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, or SQL Server. You implement the Forms Data Repository interface and register it as an OSGI service configured in the Forms Portal data service. The database table structure maps to the Forms schema. This approach enables SQL-based reporting, proper data residency compliance, and integration with existing enterprise databases. Azure Blob Storage and Amazon S3 are cloud storage options for storing the submitted XML and document of record PDF files as binary objects. Appropriate for archival storage of completed submissions. SharePoint and Salesforce are pre-built submit actions in AEM Forms as a cloud service. Submitted data goes directly to SharePoint lists or Salesforce records through the configured connector, integrating Forms directly with CRM and collaboration systems without intermediate storage in AEM. Custom submit actions, writing your own post.jsp, give complete flexibility. You can submit to any destination, calling REST APIs, writing to message queues like Kafka or RabbitMQ, transforming data, and forwarding to multiple systems. For GDPR compliance, whichever storage is used must support data subject access requests and erasure requests. Question 18. What is Automated Forms Conversion Service in AEM Forms? Automated Forms Conversion Service is an AI-powered service from Adobe that automatically converts PDF forms, including scanned paper forms, legacy PDF forms, and non-interactive PDF files, into adaptive forms. This addresses a massive enterprise challenge. Organizations often have hundreds or thousands of existing paper or PDF forms that need to be digitized as adaptive forms, but manually recreating each form as an adaptive form is enormously time-consuming. The conversion service uses machine learning models trained on millions of form samples to recognize form structure, identifying labels, fields, field sets, and form layout from the PDF. The converted adaptive form has the correct field types, text, checkbox, radio button, drop-down, date picker, bound to appropriate data paths in a generated schema. Layout is automatically adapted to responsive grid layout suitable for mobile and desktop. The conversion is not perfect, especially for complex or degraded PDF forms, but it dramatically reduces the time from days or weeks to hours per form. After conversion, form authors review the output in AEM Forms Review and Correct UI, a specialized interface that shows the original PDF alongside the converted adaptive form. Authors can correct field types, merge or split fields, fix labels, adjust the schema binding, and add rules. Accepted corrections train the model to improve future conversions. The service is accessed as a cloud service. You configure the automated forms conversion cloud configuration in AEM Forms with your Adobe I/O API credentials. The conversion is triggered from the AEM Forms interface by selecting one or more PDF files and choosing Convert. Multiple PDFs can be converted in parallel. The service is particularly valuable during AEM Forms migrations and government digitization projects where large form inventories must be converted quickly. Question 19. How do you implement custom theme and styling in AEM Forms? AEM Forms adaptive forms use a theming system that separates the form's structural content from its visual appearance, enabling brand-consistent styling across all forms in an organization. The theming layer differs between foundation component-based and core components-based forms. For foundation component-based adaptive forms, themes are defined as AEM client lib nodes with less or CSS files that override the default AEM Forms CSS variables and component styles. The theme is configured in the adaptive form container components properties, selecting from available themes. AEM provides several built-in themes, Canvas, Ultramarine, Tranquil, as starting points. Custom themes override less variables for colors, typography, spacing, border radii, and button styles. The theme CSS targets CSS class names generated by the adaptive forms rendering engine for each component type. Custom component level styles are added per field type. Themes are created and edited through the AEM Forms Theme Editor, a visual WYSIWYG interface that shows a sample form and provides style controls for each component state, default, focus, error, disabled. Changes made in the theme editor write to the theme CSS files in real time. For core components-based adaptive forms, theming follows the style system and CSS custom properties, also called CSS variables, approach from AEM sites. Theme variables are defined as CSS custom properties and the form's component styles use these variables. This allows theme switching through a single CSS property change. Inline styles in the adaptive form container define the theme's CSS variable values. A brand theme is implemented as a combination of the CSS custom properties definitions and component-level CSS overrides, packaged as a client lib. For global form branding, a shared base theme client lib imported by all form theme client libs ensures typography, button styles, and color palette are consistent. Question 20. What is AEM Forms Communications, Output and Print Channel? AEM Forms Communications, previously called Correspondence Management and Document Generation, provides the capabilities for generating high-volume, personalized, compliant correspondence and communications. It addresses the enterprise need to generate millions of personalized documents, account statements, policy documents, benefit letters, invoices, notices, by merging business data with design document templates. The two main capabilities are print channel documents and web channel documents within interactive communications, a feature that was prominent in AEM Forms 6.4 and 6.5, and the newer Communications API in AEM Forms as a cloud service. The output service is the core capability. It merges a PDF or XDP template with XML data to produce PDF or print output. Batch processing uses the output service in a loop or with the batch API to generate thousands of PDFs simultaneously, typically running as a scheduled nightly job. The assembler service handles multi-document assembly, combining multiple generated PDFs into a single package. In AEM Forms as a cloud service, the Communications API exposes document generation as a REST API. You post your XDP template reference and XML data payload to the API endpoint and receive the generated PDF as a binary response. This enables external applications to request document generation on demand without any AEM client library. Synchronous API calls generate documents in real time for scenarios where the caller needs the document immediately, like generating a confirmation letter upon loan approval. Asynchronous batch generation is used for large scheduled jobs. For personalized multi-page statements like bank account statements, the template defines the layout and the XML data contains transactional data for each customer, with conditional sections for different account types and balances. The combination of output service for generation, doc assurance for signing, and assembler for packaging creates a complete document production pipeline within AEM Forms. Question 21. How does AEM Forms handle GDPR and data privacy requirements? GDPR compliance in AEM Forms requires addressing multiple requirements: the right to access personal data, the right to erasure, data minimization, purpose limitation, and data residency. AEM Forms provides tools and capabilities to support these requirements, but compliance ultimately requires proper implementation and organizational processes. For the right to access, the Forms portal drafts and submissions component shows users their own submitted data. A custom user data service implementation, implementing the Forms user data service interface, can retrieve all data associated with a specific user ID from wherever form submissions are stored and present it in a machine-readable format for data subject access requests. For the right to erasure, the same user data service interface includes a delete data method that removes all data associated with a user ID. For JCR stored submissions, this means deleting the submission nodes. For custom database storage, this triggers database delete operations. AEM Forms as a cloud service provides a built-in privacy request console that sends data access or deletion requests to registered handlers, collecting all personal data stored across the system for a given user. For data minimization, form design should capture only the minimum necessary personal data. Use conditional fields to avoid collecting data irrelevant to the user's path through the form. For purpose limitation, store form context alongside the submission, what service the user applied for, to ensure data is not used beyond the original purpose. For data residency, use external database storage for form submissions in the required geographic region rather than JCR storage, which follows AEM's hosting location. Encrypt personal data at rest using the storage layer's encryption capabilities. The consent management integration with Adobe Experience Platform Profile allows linking form submission consent to the user's unified consent profile for downstream marketing use. Question 22. What are correspondence management templates in AEM Forms? Correspondence management, also known as letters in AEM Forms terminology, is a feature within AEM Forms for creating, managing, and generating personalized business correspondence. It is distinct from the newer Communications API approach and was the primary correspondence solution in AEM Forms 6.x. A letter template, called a letter in the AEM Forms interface, is a structured document composed of layout fragments and data-bound content areas. Letters are built from layout fragments, reusable PDF layout sections created in Lifecycle Designer, and text fragments, image fragments, list fragments, and condition fragments that define the dynamic content areas. Text fragments contain formatted text with data variables, placeholders that are replaced with business data at generation time. Condition fragments contain conditional text that appears or is hidden based on data conditions, for example, different penalty clause text for different loan types. The letter is composed by combining these fragments in a specific order through the Correspondence Management UI. When generating a letter, you select the letter template, provide the data source, an XML payload or connection to a data source, and the letter is rendered in the Create Correspondence UI where agents can review and optionally customize the letter before finalizing. Agents can modify pre-configured editable text fragments, approve or reject conditionally shown sections, and attach additional documents. The finalized letter is converted to PDF by the Forms service. In a contact center scenario, when a customer calls with a query, the agent opens the Create Correspondence UI, selects the relevant letter type, complaint acknowledgement, account closure, rate change notice, and the system pre-fills the letter with the customer's data. The agent reviews, adjusts if needed, and submits, triggering a workflow that sends the letter by email or post. Question 23. How do you configure and use the form data model with a REST API data source? Configuring a form data model with a REST API data source is one of the most common AEM Forms integration patterns, enabling forms to read data from external systems and submit data back. The configuration process involves several steps. First, you define the REST API data source as a cloud configuration in AEM. Navigate to Tools, Cloud Services, Data Sources, and create a RESTful service configuration. You provide the service root URL, the authentication type, none, basic auth, OAuth2, or mutual TLS, and the OpenAPI or Swagger specification file if available. If no Swagger is available, you configure the service manually with specific endpoint paths. Second, you create a form data model in AEM Forms at Forms Data Integrations. Select the configured REST data source. AEM reads the Swagger specification and presents the available entities and operations. Get operations become read services, post and put operations become write services. You select the entities and operations relevant to your form. Third, you map services to the FDM's data model. For each read service, you define the input arguments, for example, customer ID, and the output mapping, which response fields map to which FDM entity properties. For write services, you map FDM entity properties to request body fields. Fourth, you test the FDM services directly from the FDM interface using the test service feature, providing test input values and verifying the response structure. Authentication headers and query parameters needed for every request are configured in the data source cloud configuration as global headers. Dynamic authentication tokens, OAuth bearer tokens that expire, require configuring an OAuth 2 flow in the data source configuration, where AEM automatically refreshes the token before each service call. The FDM validation service ensures data types match between the form fields and the API request/response schema. Question 24. What is the significance of AF, bind in adaptive forms? The AF, bind or bindref attribute in adaptive forms is the data binding specification for each field. It tells AEM Forms where to read the field's pre-filled data from and where to store the field's submitted value in the form's data model. Understanding bind references is fundamental to correctly implementing data prefill, FDM integration, schema-based forms, and DOR generation. When an adaptive form is bound to an XML schema, JSON schema, or form data model, each field's bind reference points to a specific node or property in that schema. For XML schema binding, the bind ref uses XPath-like notation. For example, /customer/address/city binds the city field to the city element within the address element within the customer root. For JSON schema binding, the bind ref uses JSON-path, $.customer.address.city. For FDM binding, the bind ref points to the FDM entity property, customer.address.city. The bind reference has multiple effects. During prefill, AEM Forms reads the prefilled data XML or JSON and uses each field's bind ref to navigate to the correct value. During submission, AEM Forms builds the submission XML or JSON by writing each field's value to the location specified by its bind ref. Panels have their own bind ref that defines the root object for their contained fields. All fields within a panel with bind ref customer.address use paths relative to the address object. Repeatable panels use dynamic bind references. When the panel repeats, the bind ref auto-increments for each instance. Fields without a bind ref are unbound. They participate in form rendering and validation but are not included in the submission data model, useful for purely UI informational elements like helper text or calculated display values that should not be submitted. Question 25. How does AEM Forms as a cloud service differ from AEM Forms 6.5? AEM Forms as a cloud service is the cloud-native, SaaS version of AEM Forms with significant architectural and capability differences from the on-premise AEM Forms 6.5. Understanding these differences is important for any AEM Forms developer planning a migration or starting a new cloud project. Architecture differences. AEM Forms as a cloud service runs as a containerized, auto-scaling service. There is no on-server Java processing for forms rendering. Rendering happens in the browser through React-based core components. Server-side processing for document generation uses the communications APIs as REST endpoints rather than OSGI services invoked directly. Form submissions are stateless. There is no long-lived server session associated with a form fill session. Capability differences. Core components-based adaptive forms are the standard in cloud service and deliver better performance, accessibility, and extensibility than foundation component-based forms from AEM Forms 6.5. The automated forms conversion service is fully cloud integrated. Adobe Sign integration is native through Adobe Acrobat Sign cloud service configuration. Adobe Analytics integration for forms is native through Adobe Experience Platform data collection. Communications API provides document generation, transformation, and doc assurance as REST APIs. Removed capabilities. Correspondence management letters, the older letter creation UI, is not available in cloud service. Instead, use interactive communications or the communications API directly. Some legacy document services features have equivalents through the communications API. Development differences. Code must follow AEM as a cloud service development guidelines. No mutable content in /apps. Configurations through Cloud Manager pipelines. Service users through repository initialization. No direct console access. The AEM Forms archetype for cloud service generates the appropriate project structure. Testing uses the Cloud Manager pipeline, not local package installation in production. For organizations on AEM Forms 6.5, migration to cloud service requires assessing each form and workflow for compatibility, converting foundation component forms to core components, and migrating correspondence management letters to the new model. Question 26. Explain the AEM Forms workflow variable feature. Workflow variables in AEM Forms are named, type values that persist through the entire workflow instance and can be read and written by any workflow step. They solve the challenge of passing data between workflow steps without requiring all data to be stored in the JCR payload. Before workflow variables, passing computed values between steps required custom workarounds like writing to metadata map properties with undocumented property names or creating temporary JCR nodes. Workflow variables provide a clean, first-class mechanism. Variable types supported include string for text data, long and double for numbers, boolean for flags, date for timestamps, and, importantly for forms workflows, document for binary document objects, and JSON and XML for structured data. Variables are defined in the workflow model. In the workflow model properties, you list all variables with their names and types. In the workflow steps, variables are referenced by name. The setVariable workflow step allows setting a variable to a literal value or computing it from XPath expressions applied to form data XML. The goto step can conditionally branch the workflow based on a variable's value, enabling dynamic routing. Custom workflow process steps read and write variables through the workflow data API, workflowdata.getMetadataMap.get, myVariable, string.class. Multiple variables can be passed between or split branches to implement complex parallel workflows where each branch produces an output that is later merged. For document signing workflows, a document variable holds the generated PDF document as it passes through generation, signing, and archival steps. Each step reads the document variable, processes it, and writes back the updated document. Workflow variables make workflow models more maintainable. The data flow between steps is explicit and documented in the model definition rather than hidden in metadata map string keys. Question 27. What is the AEM Forms Output Batch API? The AEM Forms Output Batch API is the mechanism for generating large volumes of PDF documents from templates and data in a single efficient operation. The classic use case is monthly or quarterly document generation, generating 500,000 personalized account statements for all banking customers overnight. The output service in AEM Forms 6.x provides batch generation through its batch method. You prepare a batch descriptor specifying the XDP template path, the data source, typically a path to a folder of XML data files, one per document, the output path for generated PDFs, and configuration options like resolution, linearization for web optimization, and embed font settings. The output service processes all data files in the batch sequentially within a single service call, applying the template to each data XML and writing the generated PDF to the output path with a generated file name. For very large batches, the processing time can be hours. This is typically run as a scheduled nightly job. In AEM Forms as a cloud service, the Communications Batch API replaces the on-server output service. It is invoked through a REST API call specifying the template, data location in cloud blob storage, and output location in blob storage. The API processes the batch asynchronously. You receive a batch job ID and poll for completion status. The cloud batch processing scales horizontally. Multiple simultaneous rendition workers process different data files in parallel, dramatically reducing total processing time for large batches compared to single-threaded on-server processing. Error handling in batch generation is critical. The batch must not fail entirely if one data file is malformed. The output service and communications API both provide per-document error reporting in the batch result, allowing failed documents to be reprocessed separately. Automated alerting on batch failure rates is essential for production batch document generation pipelines. Question 28. How do you implement lazy loading in adaptive forms for better performance? Lazy loading in adaptive forms optimizes form load time and rendering performance, especially important for large, complex multi-step forms where loading all panels and their JavaScript at once creates a slow initial load experience. AEM Forms provides two levels of lazy loading. Panel-level lazy loading defers the initialization of panels that are not immediately visible. In a wizard-style adaptive form with 10 steps, only the first step's panel content and its JavaScript rules need to be initialized on page load. Subsequent panels are initialized lazily when the user navigates to them. To enable lazy loading for a panel, check the Lazy Load checkbox in the panel's properties. When the form renders, lazy loaded panels emit minimal HTML placeholder markup initially. When the user navigates to the panel, a JavaScript call fetches the panel's full content from the AEM Forms servlet and dynamically injects it into the DOM, initializing its fields and rules. This reduces the initial page weight significantly. Fragment-level lazy loading uses adaptive form fragments, reusable form segments created in AEM Forms and referenced in multiple forms. Fragments can be configured to load lazily when the containing panel becomes active. For forms with many fragments, this distributes the loading across the user's session rather than front-loading everything. Client-lib optimization, merging and minifying all JavaScript and CSS, is another performance technique, handled through the adaptive forms template configuration. The form JavaScript runtime, af.core.js, should be served with maximum age cache headers so repeat visitors get it from browser cache. For very large forms, server-side rendering of the initial state, returning fully rendered HTML for the first visible panel, is possible through the AEM Forms rendering pipeline customization. Question 29. What is the AEM Forms integration with Microsoft Dynamics CRM? AEM Forms integration with Microsoft Dynamics CRM enables forms to read data from Dynamics entities for prefill and write submitted form data to Dynamics on submission, integrating form-based processes with CRM workflows. The integration uses the Form Data Model's OData connector. Microsoft Dynamics CRM exposes its data through OData version 4.0 REST API endpoints. To configure the integration, create a cloud configuration for OData service pointing to your Dynamics CRM OData endpoint with OAuth 2 authentication using Azure Active Directory credentials. In the FDM, select this OData source and import the Dynamics entities you need: contact, account, lead, opportunity, case. Each entity becomes an FDM data model object with its fields available for binding. Read services, typically the get operation on the entity using a filter like email address equal to the logged-in user's email, prefill the form with existing customer data. Write services, the create or update operation, submit new or updated records to Dynamics after form completion. Common scenarios include customer service forms where agents fill in case details and the submission creates a new case record in Dynamics linked to the customer's account, or lead capture forms where new inquiries create lead records in Dynamics for the sales team. For complex Dynamics relationships, for example, creating an account and a related contact in a single form submission, a custom OSGI service implementing pre-FDM data transformation batches multiple Dynamics API calls. The Microsoft Dynamics connector is one of several pre-built connectors in AEM Forms as a cloud service. Others include Salesforce, SharePoint, and Azure Blob Storage, all configurable through the same cloud services interface without writing custom connector code. Question 30. How do you debug adaptive form rule execution issues? Debugging rule execution issues in adaptive forms requires understanding where rules run, client-side JavaScript in the browser versus server-side invocations for FDM services, and using the appropriate tools for each layer. Browser-side rule debugging is done through the browser developer tools. Open Chrome DevTools or Firefox Developer Tools and go to the Console tab. AEM Forms logs rule execution events, field value changes, rule triggers, rule results, to the browser console when the form is in debug mode. Add the debug equals true query parameter to the form URL to enable verbose logging. The console shows which rule fired, what condition was evaluated, and what action was taken. For FDM service invocation rules, the console shows the XHR request to the FDM endpoint and the response. You can inspect the request payload, the input arguments, and the response, the data returned, to identify mismatches. The Network tab shows all AJAX calls made during form interaction, FDM service calls, form data prefill requests, and validation requests. Filter by XHR to see only API calls. Common rule issues include incorrect field reference names in rules. The rule editor uses the field's name property, not its title or label. If a rule references a field by a name that does not match the field's name property, the rule silently fails. Check field names in the adaptive form editor under each field's properties. Circular rule dependencies, where field A's rule changes field B, whose rule changes field A, cause infinite loops and browser hanging. Identify these through console logging. For server-side FDM service issues, check the AEM error.log for stack traces from the FDM servlet. Enable debug logging for the package com.adobe.aem.formsdocuments.fdm in the Sling log configuration. FDM test mode, testing services directly from the FDM editor, helps isolate whether the issue is in the service configuration or the rule binding. Question 31. What is AEM Forms Interactive Communication? Interactive communication in AEM Forms is a feature introduced in AEM Forms 6.4 that enables the creation of multi-channel communications, delivering the same core content as both a personalized print document and an interactive web experience. It extends the older correspondence management capability with a unified authoring environment for both channels. An interactive communication template has two channels. The print channel produces a print-ready PDF document, typically a formal business communication like a quarterly account statement, an insurance policy document, or a benefits summary. The layout is pixel-precise, using XDP-based print fragments for exact visual control. The web channel produces a responsive, interactive HTML experience that the recipient views in a browser or email, scrollable, with charts, graphs, and interactive elements that bring the data to life beyond what a static PDF can offer. The same core data model, connected through the form data model, feeds both channels, ensuring the data is consistent between the print and web versions. For example, a bank account statement in print channel shows transaction tables in a formal layout suitable for printing and archiving. The web channel version shows the same transactions with interactive filtering, clickable categories that drill into spending analysis, and embedded bar charts showing spending trends. Authors create the two channels in the interactive communication editor, a split-pane authoring environment with print on one side and web on the other. Content authors can create the print layout using Design Editor with drag-and-drop fragments, and create the web layout using a panel-based responsive layout. Both channels share the same FDM binding. Interactive communication is used in large enterprises for regulatory communications. The print PDF goes to the archive and mailing, while the web version is served through the online customer portal. Question 32. How does AEM Forms support CAPTCHA and bot prevention? Bot prevention in AEM Forms is essential for public-facing forms, contact forms, registration forms, inquiry forms, that are targets for automated spam submissions. Without protection, bots can flood your submission database with fake data, exhaust server resources, and pollute your CRM with worthless leads. AEM Forms supports multiple CAPTCHA approaches. Google reCAPTCHA v2 is the most widely used. It presents the I am not a robot checkbox or image challenges to suspicious traffic. Configuration is through a Google reCAPTCHA cloud configuration in AEM with the site key and secret key from your Google console. The adaptive form includes a CAPTCHA component that renders the reCAPTCHA widget. On the server side, the form submission handler calls Google's reCAPTCHA verification API with the user's token before processing the submission. If verification fails, the submission is rejected. Google reCAPTCHA v3 is the invisible version, no user interaction required. Instead, reCAPTCHA assigns a score between 0 and 1 to every request based on user behavior analysis. AEM Forms uses this score on the server side. Submissions scoring below a configured threshold are rejected or require additional verification. HCAPTCHA is a privacy-respecting alternative to Google reCAPTCHA, increasingly used in privacy-conscious European markets. AEM Forms 6.5 and Cloud Service support HCAPTCHA through cloud configuration. Cloudflare Turnstile is another privacy-focused alternative available as a community-supported AEM Forms extension. For internal forms where bot protection is less critical but security is still needed, AEM's built-in form token, a CSRF token embedded in the form and validated server-side, prevents automated submission from other origins. Custom bot detection can combine server-side checks, rate limiting by IP, honeypot fields that real users leave blank but bots fill, and timing analysis for multi-layered protection. Question 33. What are adaptive form fragments and when should you use them? Adaptive form fragments are reusable sections of adaptive forms, panels containing fields, rules, and layout configuration that can be created once and referenced in multiple different forms. They are the form equivalent of a software library, write once, use many times, maintain in one place. The business case for fragments is strong. Many forms in an enterprise share common sections, a standard address block with street, city, state, postal code, and country fields, a payment information section with credit card number, CVV, and expiry fields, an emergency contact section, or a legal consent section with terms acceptance checkboxes. Without fragments, each form team copies and maintains these sections independently, leading to version drift where the address block in the loan application has different validation than in the account opening form. With fragments, you define the canonical address section once as a fragment, and every form that needs an address block references this fragment. When you update the fragment, adding a field, fixing a validation rule, all forms using it automatically get the update. Technically, a fragment is stored as a node under /content/down/forms-and-documents/fragments. It is authored in the AEM Forms editor like a normal adaptive form panel. When a form references a fragment, the fragment component in the form renders the fragment's content at authoring and runtime. At authoring time, the fragment appears inline in the form canvas, and form authors can see its fields, but to edit the fragment, they must open the fragment itself, not the containing form. At runtime, the fragment's HTML is injected into the form's DOM. Fragment data is included in the form submission data under the panel bind reference. For forms shared across different brands or sub-brands, a fragment with a brand-specific layout configuration allows the same content with different styling. Question 34. How do you implement a custom prefill service in AEM Forms? A custom prefill service in AEM Forms is an OSGI service implementing the data provider or forms prefill service interface that provides prefill data for adaptive forms from any data source, an internal database, an external API, a SOAP service, or computed data based on the current user's context. Implementing a custom prefill service gives complete control over what data is loaded and how it is structured for the form. The implementation steps are as follows. First, create a Java OSGI component class and implement the Forms Prefill Service interface from the com.adobe.forms.common.service package. Annotate it with that component and at service with a service.pid property that uniquely identifies this service. This is the ID you configure in the adaptive form to select this prefill service. Implement the getPrefillData method. This method receives the adaptive form name, the sling request, and the template path. Inside this method, you have access to the full sling request, including the currently logged-in user session, URL parameters, and request headers. You use this context to fetch data, for example, read the user's customer ID from their profile in the JCR, call a REST API with that customer ID, parse the response, and build a data.xml object that maps the response fields to the form's data model. The data.xml is an XML document with a structure matching the form's bind reference paths. The root element is AF-bound data, under which you nest elements matching the form's schema. For form data model-based prefill, you can invoke FDM read services programmatically within the prefill service using the Forms Data Integration Helper service. After registering the service, the adaptive form is configured to use it by selecting the service name in the form container's basic prefill service dropdown. Custom prefill services enable prefill from any data source regardless of whether a form data model connector exists for it. Question 35. What is the AEM Forms Analytics integration? AEM Forms Analytics integration with Adobe Analytics, or with other analytics platforms, provides insight into how users interact with forms, revealing abandonment points, field errors, and completion rates that drive data-driven form optimization. Understanding where users drop off or struggle is critical for improving form completion rates, which directly impacts conversion and business outcomes. The integration works through AEM Analytics Cloud configuration pointing to your Adobe Analytics report suite. When configured, AEM Forms automatically tracks the following events for each adaptive form interaction: form render events when the form loads, field focus events when users click into a field change events when field values are submitted or changed, form abandon events when users leave the form without submitting, form submission events on successful submission, and form error events when server-side validation fails. These events are sent to Adobe Analytics as analytics hits with the form name, field name, step number, and event type as custom dimensions. In Adobe Analytics, you build reports showing form completion rate, submitted versus rendered, by form name, field abandonment rate, which fields do most users leave without completing, step abandonment in multi-step forms, which wizard step is the biggest drop-off point, and submission error rates by field. AEM Forms also integrates with Adobe Experience Platform for event streaming through the Web SDK. Form interaction events become experience events in platform. In AEM Forms as a cloud service, the analytics integration uses Adobe Experience Platform data collection through the platform's pre-built AEM Forms extension for Adobe Launch. This extension automatically captures form events and sends them to the analytics destination configured in the Launch property. A/B testing of form designs, using Adobe Target, is enabled through the Forms analytics integration, allowing you to test different field orders, label wording, or button copy and measure which variant achieves higher completion rates. Question 36. How do you implement server-side validation in AEM Forms beyond field-level validation? While Adaptive Forms Rule Editor handles field-level validation client-side, complex business validation, checking cross-field dependencies, validating against back-end data, enforcing business rules that cannot be expressed as simple field rules, requires server-side validation. AEM Forms provides two mechanisms for server-side validation. The first is the server-side revalidation, available in AEM Forms 6.3 and later, which reruns the validation rules defined in the rule editor on the server before processing the submission. This prevents client-side JavaScript manipulation of validation. Enable it by checking the revalidate on server checkbox in the form container's submission settings. The second mechanism is the submit action validation. In your custom submit actions post-servlet, perform business validation using the submitted form data XML. For example, check if the selected appointment time slot is still available by querying an external scheduling service, or verify that the submitted national ID number is valid according to the checksum algorithm for the selected country. If validation fails, return a JSON error response with the field path and error message. The adaptive form JavaScript listens for validation error responses and displays them on the correct fields, even for server-side errors. For FDM-based validation, you can invoke an FDM read service in the prefill service or in a custom validation step to cross-check form data against authoritative backend data. For complex workflow-based validation, where the submission triggers a workflow and a workflow step validates the data, potentially routing to a manual review if automated validation is inconclusive, the form submission shows a pending status while the workflow runs, and a custom notification workflow step emails the user the final outcome. For regulatory compliance, where every validation decision must be auditable, log all server-side validation decisions with the submitter's user ID, the submitted data hash, and the validation result to a tamper-evident audit log. Question 37. What is the AEM Forms Scribble Signature component? The Scribble Signature component in AEM Forms provides a touch and mouse-based handwriting signature capture capability within Adaptive Forms, allowing users to draw their signature directly on the form without requiring a PDF viewer or external signing service. This is useful for simple acknowledgement scenarios, consent capture on mobile devices, and field service forms where a customer signs on a technician's tablet. The Scribble Signature component renders a canvas element in the browser where the user draws their signature using a touch stylus, finger, or mouse. The signature is captured as a PNG image encoded as a base 64 string. This image is stored as the value of the signature field and is included in the form submission data. The document of record, the generated PDF snapshot of the submission, embeds the signature image in the signature field area, giving the DOR a visual signature that provides some level of evidence of consent. It is important to understand the difference between Scribble signatures and legally binding electronic signatures. Scribble signatures captured in a browser canvas provide basic evidence of intent but lack the cryptographic non-repudiation, identity verification, and tamper detection that Adobe Sign electronic signatures provide. For legally binding scenarios, contracts, financial agreements, regulatory submissions, Adobe Sign integration is required. Scribble signatures are appropriate for internal processes, simple acknowledgements, and scenarios where the form itself serves as a process record rather than a legal contract. The Scribble Signature component supports configuring the canvas size, the line color, the stroke width, and whether to allow clearing and redrawing. The signature image stored in the JCR as part of the form data should be treated as potentially sensitive personal data for GDPR purposes. Question 38. How do you use AEM Forms to create a kiosk or in-person form experience? AEM Forms supports kiosk and in-person form scenarios, such as tablets at retail counters, self-service kiosks in banks or government offices, or tablets used by field service technicians, with specific configurations that differ from standard web form delivery. For kiosk scenarios, the key requirements are that the form works offline or with intermittent connectivity, the form resets cleanly between users without exposing the previous user's data, the form is optimized for touch interaction, and submissions are reliably stored even when connectivity is lost. For offline capability, AEM Forms previously used the AEM Forms app, a native iOS and Android application that downloads forms and allows fill-in offline, syncing submissions when connectivity is restored. The AEM Forms app is configurable with the AEM server URL and credentials, downloads assigned forms to local storage, captures submissions locally, and syncs them to the AEM server in the background. For tablet-based field service, the app supports GPS location capture, photo attachment from the camera, and barcode scanning for asset identification. For modern progressive web app approaches, AEM Forms as a cloud service forms can be enhanced with service worker caching of the form assets, enabling offline-capable web forms without a native app. For shared kiosk devices, automatic session cleanup after form submission is essential. Configure the submission success action to navigate to a sanitized landing page or close the browser tab. Device management solutions like Microsoft Intune or Jamf ensure kiosk tablets stay in single app mode. Touch-optimized form styling uses larger touch targets, fields at least 44 pixels tall per Apple and Google HIG guidelines, larger fonts, and simplified layouts that work well on 10-inch tablet screens. Question 39. Explain the AEM Forms FDM computed properties. Form data model computed properties are virtual FDM properties whose values are calculated dynamically from other entity properties or from custom JavaScript expressions rather than being directly retrieved from the data source. They allow the FDM to expose derived data that is useful for form prefill and display but does not exist as a discrete property in the backend system. For example, a customer entity in a database has first name and last name properties but not a full name property. A computed property full name in the FDM is defined with the expression this.firstname plus this.lastname. When a form field is bound to this computed property, it shows the full name. Similarly, a customer entity might have date of birth. A computed age property uses the expression math.floor, new date, this.date of birth, /365.25 by 24 by 60 *60 by 1000 to calculate the customer's current age in years. Computed properties can also reference other FDM services. For example, a computed property credit status calls an FDM read service to check the customer's credit bureau status and returns a human-readable string based on the returned code. The expression is written in JavaScript and executes server-side within the FDM runtime. A critical use case is unit conversion. A product entity stores weight in grams from the API, but the form should display it in kilograms. A computed weight kg property with expression this.weight grams /1000 handles this transparently. Computed properties also support conditional logic, returning different values based on other properties. They are a powerful way to decouple the form's data model from the backend data structure, reducing the need for custom server-side transformation code in every form that uses the same entity. Question 40. What is the watched folder mechanism in AEM Forms? The watched folder mechanism in AEM Forms is a file system-based integration pattern where AEM Forms monitors a designated folder on the server's file system and automatically processes any files dropped into it. This is an asynchronous, batch-oriented integration pattern suitable for scenarios where the data producer cannot make API calls, for example, a legacy mainframe system that can only output flat files, or a scheduled extract from a data warehouse that writes CSV files. The watched folder configuration, an OSGI service configuration, specifies the input folder path to watch, the output folder for process results, the failure folder for files that could not be processed, the file include pattern, for example, only process files matching star.xml, the polling interval, how frequently to check the folder, and the result time to live for keeping results in the output folder. The processing action specifies what to do with each file, invoke a document service operation, call a custom OSGI service, or run a workflow. For document generation, you configure the watched folder to invoke the output service. Input files are XML data files. The output service merges each data file with a configured XDP template and writes the output PDF to the output folder. For bulk statement generation without the Communications Batch API, this is a practical approach. The data feed team drops XML data files into the input folder and picks up generated PDFs from the output folder. For custom processing, a watched folder endpoint exposes an OSGI service that implements specific input-output contracts. Error handling includes moving unprocessable files to the failure folder and writing error logs. The watched folder polling uses file lock mechanisms to prevent processing the same file concurrently. In AEM Forms as a cloud service, the cloud-native equivalent uses Azure Blob Storage Trigger through Azure Logic Apps or Azure Functions, which is more scalable and reliable than a local file system watch. Question 41. How do you implement localization and multi-language support in AEM Forms? AEM Forms provides comprehensive localization support for adaptive forms, enabling the same form to be presented in multiple languages based on the user's locale or explicit language selection. Localization in adaptive forms works at 3 levels. The first level is UI string localization. All field labels, button text, validation messages, placeholder text, and help text can be localized. AEM Forms stores UI strings in I18N translation files, .properties files organized by locale code under /libs/fd/af/localization and /apps/urap/components/adaptive forms/localization. You provide translations for the default AEM Forms UI strings by creating locale-specific .properties files in your overlay path. Custom field labels defined by form authors are stored as properties on the form definition node in the JCR and are accessible for translation through the AEM translation integration. The second level is form content localization. When an adaptive form contains static text, instructional text, section headers, checkbox labels, these are authored per locale by creating separate form versions for each language, similar to how AEM Sites page content is localized through language copies. Using AEM's translation integration framework, you can send form content for professional translation and import the translated form automatically. The third level is dynamic content localization. Data returned from form data model services, country names, address formats, currency formats, should be locale-aware. FDM service invocations pass the current locale as a service input parameter, and the backend service returns locale-appropriate data. Date picker and number fields in adaptive forms respect the user's locale for format, dd/mm/yyyy in the UK versus mm/dd/yyyy in the US. Right-to-left language support, Arabic, Hebrew, requires RTL-aware form layouts and CSS direction configurations. Question 42. What is the role of the AEM Forms Publish instance in form delivery? The AEM Forms Publish instance serves the same role as AEM Sites Publish instance. It is the production-facing instance that end users interact with, separate from the author instance where forms are designed. However, the AEM Forms delivery model has specific characteristics and requirements compared to Sites pages. When a form is ready for end users, it is published from author to publish through the standard AEM replication mechanism. The adaptive form nodes, under/content/down/forms/documents, the form template, the client libraries, and any referenced fragments or themes are all replicated. The form data model cloud configurations are replicated. The FDM's data source cloud configurations, containing API endpoints and credentials, must be separately configured on the publish instance rather than replicated from author, as author and publish typically connect to different data source environments. On the publish instance, anonymous users can access forms configured for anonymous access. Authenticated forms require users to be logged in. AEM standard authentication mechanisms apply. The publish instance must have the AEM Forms add-on package installed, the same OSGI bundles that power form rendering, FDM service invocations, and submission processing. For scalability, multiple publish instances can be run behind a load balancer. Form submissions are stateless. Any publish instance can process any submission without session affinity. For forms that use save and resume, storing draft data in the JCR, a shared data store is needed across publish instances so that a draft saved on one instance can be retrieved from another. In AEM as a cloud service, the publish tier is auto-scaling and stateless by design. Draft data must be stored externally, not in the JCR. Dispatcher caching for forms must be configured carefully. Form HTML should be cached, but form submission endpoints and FDM service proxy endpoints must not be cached. Question 43. How do you handle file attachments in AEM Forms? File attachments in adaptive forms allow users to upload supporting documents, identity proof, bank statements, photos, signed PDFs, alongside their form data. Managing attachments correctly requires addressing upload mechanics, storage, security, and submission handling. The file attachment component in adaptive forms allows configuring the accepted file types through MIME type patterns, the maximum file size per attachment, the maximum number of attachments, and whether attachments are mandatory or optional. Multiple file attachment components can be on the same form for different document categories, identity proof and income proof as separate upload components. The upload mechanism sends files to the AEM Forms binary upload servlet, a multi-part post to the form endpoint. Files are temporarily stored in the AEM repository under a secure, session-scoped path. The component shows a preview, thumbnail for images, PDF icon for PDFs, and allows the user to remove and replace attachments. On form submission, the attachment binary data is part of the submission package. The submission handling for attachments depends on the submit action. For FDM submit action, attachments are passed as binary parameters to the FDM write service. The service must accept them as file inputs. For custom submit actions, the attachment data is in the request as a part of the multi-part body. You read it using request.getPart, or the adaptive form helpers get attachments method, then store it wherever needed, JCR binary nodes, S3, SharePoint, or a document management system. For workflow-based submissions, attachments are stored in the Workflow Payloads attachment folder and are accessible to workflow steps as document objects. Security considerations include validating file types server-side, not trusting the MIME type from the client alone, scanning attachments for malware through an antivirus service, and ensuring attachment storage paths are not accessible to unauthorized users. Question 44. What is AEM Forms Correspondence Management, Asset Types? Correspondence management in AEM Forms provides a rich set of reusable asset types that compose the building blocks of business letters and communications. Understanding these asset types and how they interact is fundamental to implementing correspondence management solutions. Text fragments are the primary content containers. Each text fragment is a block of rich text, formatted with fonts, sizes, colors, alignment, and can contain variable placeholders enclosed in braces that are replaced with data values at generation time. For example, Dear Customer, first name, your account ending in account, last 4 digits, has a balance of account balance. Text fragments can be locked, preventing agents from modifying them, or editable, allowing agents to customize the text for specific customer situations. Image fragments are reusable images that appear in letters, logos, signatures, charts. They are referenced in the letter layout. List fragments group multiple text or image fragments into a structured, numbered, or bulleted list, useful for standard terms and conditions clauses where individual clauses are separate text fragments that can be mixed and matched. Condition fragments define conditional content, using FDM data conditions to show or hide content blocks. For example, show a late payment penalty clause only when the account is past due, or show different interest rate disclosures based on the product type. Layout fragments are XDP-based PDF layout templates that define the visual positioning, page dimensions, margins, headers, and footers of the letter. They are created in Adobe Lifecycle Designer. The letter itself, the top-level correspondence management asset, references layout fragments and defines the order and conditionality of text, list, image, and condition fragments. At generation time, the letter assembler combines all referenced fragments according to the data values, producing the final PDF. Question 45. Explain the AEM Forms Reader Extensions capability. Reader Extensions is a document services capability in AEM Forms that applies additional usage rights to PDF documents, enabling PDF features in the free Adobe Acrobat Reader that are otherwise only available in the paid Adobe Acrobat Standard or Pro. This is significant for PDF forms and documents intended for distribution to end users who have only Adobe Acrobat Reader installed. Without Reader Extensions, a PDF form distributed to a user with only Acrobat Reader cannot be saved after filling, the user must print it and cannot digitally submit it. With Reader Extensions applied, the PDF becomes an extended reader PDF that unlocks specific capabilities. Specific rights that Reader Extensions can enable include, save form data, users can save the completed PDF to their computer, submit forms online, submit the PDF electronically, add comments and annotations, users can use Acrobat Reader's commenting tools to annotate the document, digital signatures, users can sign the PDF with a digital certificate in Acrobat Reader, import form data, import XML data into the PDF, export form data, export filled form data as XML or FDF. The rights are applied cryptographically using a special Reader Extensions credential, an X.509 certificate licensed by Adobe for specific usage rights. This credential is installed in AEM Forms through the Doc Assurance Service configuration. The Doc Assurance Service's Reader Extension operation takes the PDF document and the desired rights flags as input and returns the rights-enabled PDF. Important usage licensing consideration, Reader Extensions credentials have usage limits. Typically the license permits a specific number of rights-enabled PDFs per year based on the type of usage. Organizations must track their usage to stay within their license bounds. Adobe's licensing is strict about Reader Extensions usage rights, and violations can result in credential revocation. Question 46. How does AEM Forms support geolocation and maps integration? AEM Forms supports geolocation and maps integration through custom field components and rule editor service invocations, enabling Forms to capture the user's location, autocomplete addresses, and show location-based information. Geolocation capture uses the browser's geolocation API, navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, invoked through a custom rule or a custom field component. The user's latitude and longitude are captured and stored in hidden form fields. A custom rule editor function wraps the geolocation API and returns the coordinates asynchronously. This is used in field service forms where the technician's location is automatically logged, or in emergency service forms where the caller's location is captured. Address autocomplete integrates with Google Maps Places API, Here Maps, or the government's postal code lookup APIs through an FDM service call. The address field has a rule editor rule that invokes a service when the user finishes typing a partial address, returning a list of suggestions. When the user selects a suggestion, the rule populates the street, city, state, and postal code fields automatically. This reduces data entry errors and speeds up form completion significantly. For store or branch locator functionality within Forms, showing the nearest service location to the user, a custom panel uses the Google Maps JavaScript API to render an interactive map, and an FDM service provides the branch data. The map renders in a custom field component's HTML canvas. Important security consideration: Google Maps API keys embedded in client-side JavaScript must be restricted by domain in the Google Cloud Console to prevent unauthorized usage that could incur unexpected billing. For GDPR compliance, geolocation capture must be disclosed in the Forms privacy notice and requires explicit user consent before the geolocation prompt is triggered. Question 47. How do you implement a time-limited secure form link in AEM Forms? Time-limited secure form links are used when you need to send a form link to a specific recipient, email with a one-time use application link, a secure reset link, a personalized renewal form that expires after a certain period or after first use, and that pre-fills the form with the recipient's data without requiring them to log in. Implementing this involves several components. First, a link generator service, an AEM Sling servlet or a Java OSGI service, creates a secure token when the link needs to be generated. The token encodes the recipient's identifier, customer ID, email, or case number, the form URL, an expiry timestamp, and an optional one-use flag, all signed with a server-side secret using HMAC, SHA-256. The token is base 64 encoded and appended to the form URL as a query parameter. This token is stored in the JCR or a database with the expiry timestamp and consumed status. The link, with the token, is sent to the recipient by email. When the recipient clicks the link, a Sling filter or servlet interceptor reads the token parameter, validates the HMAC signature to ensure it was not tampered with, checks the expiry timestamp, checks if it has already been used, for one-use links, and if all checks pass, extracts the recipient identifier. The identifier is placed in the request as an attribute or session attribute. The Forms custom prefill service reads this attribute and fetches the appropriate prefill data for that recipient. On successful form submission, the token is marked as consumed in the database so it cannot be used again. For security, tokens must be long enough, at least 32 random bytes, to resist brute force guessing. Expiry times should be business appropriate, short for sensitive operations, longer for convenience use cases. Question 48. What is AEM Forms Process Reporting? AEM Forms Process Reporting, available in AEM Forms on JEE and partially in the OSGI version, provides a reporting and analytics capability for monitoring the execution of Forms workflows and document generation processes. It addresses the operational need to understand workflow performance, identify bottlenecks, track completion rates, and generate compliance evidence. Process reporting collects data from the AEM Forms database, the tables that store workflow instance data, process step data, task durations, and user assignments. It provides pre-built reports and dashboards through a web interface. Key built-in reports include process summary showing counts of running, completed, and failed workflow instances over time periods, process duration analysis showing average and maximum time for each workflow to complete, helping identify which workflows are taking too long and potentially require optimization, step duration analysis breaking down time spent in each step of a workflow, identifying which participant steps are the bottleneck, for example, if the manager approval step averages 5 days, the process improvement team knows where to focus. Failed processes report listing all workflow instances that failed, with the failure point and error details, essential for operational monitoring. For AEM Forms on OSGI, the more modern deployment, workflow reporting uses AEM standard workflow reporting at tools, workflow reports. Augmented by custom Sling servlets that query the Forms workflow data, stored in the JCR_var/workflow, and present custom dashboards, organizations can build tailored operational metrics. For executive dashboards, form submission volumes, completion rates, and DocuSign signature turnaround times are valuable KPIs. Integration with Adobe Analytics or Power BI provides richer visualization and cross-system reporting combining Forms data with CRM and business outcome data. Question 49. How do you implement a custom widget for adaptive forms using React? Custom widgets for core components-based adaptive forms in AEM Forms as a cloud service are implemented as React components following the adaptive forms headless architecture. The AEM Forms headless model separates form data management from UI rendering. The form data model drives all field state, validation, and rule execution through a JavaScript layer called the adaptive forms runtime, while the UI is rendered by pluggable React components. To implement a custom React widget, you start by installing the AEM Forms/AF React Components package, which provides the base component classes and hooks, higher order components. Your custom widget is a React functional component that receives standard props, value for the current field value, label for the field label, description for help text, required for validation state, error message for current validation error, read-only for read-only state, and the dispatch function for emitting state changes back to the AF runtime. When the user changes the widget's value, you call dispatch with the action change_value and the new value. The AF runtime processes this action, runs validation rules, executes dependent rules, and updates the field value in the data model. Your component re-renders with the updated value prop. To register your custom widget, you create a mapper object that maps a custom field type identifier, which you define in the adaptive form field's component type property, to your React component. This mapper is passed to the adaptive form component renderer. The entire React form is rendered into a DOM element on the page through the AEM Forms/AF React renderer package. Client lib packaging wraps your React widget build output, typically Webpack or V-compiled, as an AEM client lib with the category AF.CustomWidgets, so the form includes it automatically. Testing uses React testing library for unit tests and Cypress for end-to-end tests that fill the form in a real browser. Question 50. What are key AEM Forms performance optimization best practices? Performance optimization for AEM Forms covers multiple layers: form rendering speed, FDM service call latency, document generation throughput, and workflow processing performance. Here are the comprehensive best practices. For form rendering performance, minimize the number of rules evaluated on initial load, defer rules that depend on user input to the events that trigger them. Use lazy loading for panels not immediately visible. Combine and minify client libs. Use CDN for serving static assets like theme CSS and JavaScript libraries. Profile form load using browser DevTools performance recording, identify the most expensive JavaScript executions and optimize them. For FDM service performance, cache FDM read service responses when the data does not change per request. Use the FDM's cache configuration or implement an application-level cache in your custom prefill service using Guava Cache or Caffeine with appropriate TTL. Avoid calling FDM services from rule editor on every field interaction. Call services on panel navigation or on specific user actions, not on every keystroke. For the FDM data source itself, ensure the REST API being called is fast. Optimize the API endpoint to return only the needed fields. For document generation throughput, use batch generation through the Communications API rather than synchronous individual generation. Scale the AEM Forms document services horizontally on JE, clustering multiple forms servers behind a load balancer. For workflow performance, configure workflow queue thread pool sizes appropriate to your hardware, more threads for CPU-bound steps on multi-core servers, fewer for I/O-bound steps waiting on external services. Use transient workflows that do not persist intermediate state, for high-volume, short-lived processes like automated document generation that does not need user review. Monitor the workflow queue depth and thread utilization through JMX. For the JCR repository, periodic version purge and session close discipline prevent repository bloat and session leaks.